But speaking here at chapter 66, why don't I read the segment here, or the excerpt of the Eucharist. And this, Justin writes, "And this food is called among us Eucharistia, the Eucharist, of which no one is allowed to partake but the man who believes that the things which we teach are true, and who has been washed with the washing that is for the remission of sins, and unto regeneration, and who is so living as Christ has enjoined." So what's he saying in this paragraph?
Well, first of all, one thing we want to note here is that he refers to the rite, R-I-T-E, as the Eucharist. We ordinarily today refer to it as the Lord's Supper, using the language of Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Sometimes we call it communion, from the Greek word koinonia, which Paul also uses with respect to the supper in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. But neither of those terms, the Lord's Supper or communion, were frequent in the ancient church. The most frequent name used in the earliest Christian documents that we have for the Lord's Supper is the Eucharist. That's what's used in the Didache, and that's used here in Justin Martyr. Ignatius refers to it as the agape. Now, there's a question as to whether the agape refers to a meal that was observed in connection with the Lord's Supper, or if those two were originally one and the same and only came to be separated later. Ignatius doesn't make any distinction between the agape and what we refer to as the Lord's Supper. But the meal is referred to here by Justin as the Eucharistia, the Eucharist. Eucharistia, of course, means thanksgiving, and that term comes from one of the acts that is done in the supper. Jesus, when he had taken bread, gave thanks. So he prayed a prayer of thanksgiving, a Eucharistia. So one of the chief elements in, or one of the chief acts in the Lord's Supper is the prayer of thanksgiving, the Eucharistic prayer. And the meal itself is sometimes simply referred to as the Eucharist because of one of the principal acts that is done in the meal. And that's how Justin refers to it here. Justin also notes here in this opening section, who are the proper recipients of the Lord's Supper. Justin gives three prerequisites for one who would partake of the meal. He has to be a believer. He has to believe the gospel. He has to be baptized, as he had previously defined it in chapter 61, baptism as the washing away of sins and as unto regeneration. And he has to live the Christian life. And so the Lord's table is restricted to certain persons, to those who meet these requirements. The Lord's table is fenced, if we can use a modern term. It's not open to just anyone, but it's open to persons who meet these.
Right. But even early on at that stage, then people would not have been, or did not practice paedo communion, for example, because of these requirements. These would be incompatible with those restrictions, correct?
Well, I think so. Now, there is a debate on whether paedo communion was practiced in the ancient church in Justin's day, as there is also a debate on whether paedo baptism was practiced in his day as well. Generally speaking, those who believe that paedo baptism was practiced in the ancient church generally believe that paedo communion was also practiced. But the evidence is not entirely clear. There seems to be some diversity on who received communion. Did all those baptized receive communion or not? That's a good question, and maybe we can come back to that some other time.
Interesting.